And while all that is going on, the House Financial Services Committee is close to wrapping up a hearing to overhaul regulation on Wall Street and also on your money. Here to talk to us about that and the rest of the busy Washington agenda is the committee's ranking Republican member, Congressman Spencer Bachus of Alabama. Representative, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle.
When it comes to financial regulation, one of the most controversial aspects of this is the Consumer Protection Agency. Is that going to survive? Did you hear anything that's going to convince the Democrats to let that one go?
Well, I tell you, it's just another government agency, and we already have 6 federal regulators of the banks. So they're going to create a 7th one, and that's going to grow government, and the consumers are going to pay the cost.
Is that going to get through, though?
You know, I don't think it will, because I believe the American people, whether it's on health care, whether it's on energy, or on this bill, they want to make choices. They don't want the government limiting their choices. They don't want the government making choices for them. You know, the government and these federal regulators ought to protect them from fraud, protect them from abuse and predatory practices. But when you start telling them what contract they can enter into and the terms of that contract, it gets to be a lot of big brother.
Congressman, the other rather controversial topic is the super regulator, if you will, and a lot of people think it should be the Fed. An equal number of people are very worried that if it is the Fed, it really throws a wrench into the Fed's mandate right now. Would you favor the Fed in that role or not?
Well, I don't want a permanent bailout agency, and that's what I'm afraid that they're talking about. I've asked Secretary Geithner, I've asked the chairman, Ben Bernanke, are you going to use taxpayer money to bail out failed institutions? And they say they're not, but the law allows them to do it. The Obama proposal allows them to put more taxpayer money.
But do you think that the person or the entity that is in that role should be the Federal Reserve, or do you think, as many people do, that some of what we're in right now happened on the Fed's watch and they should not be that super regulator?
It did happen on the Fed watch, and there are 2 or 3 big mistakes the Fed made. I would say put it all in what the Republicans say, let's put it all in a bank regulator under an umbrella, which brings the OCC, the OTS, merges them and brings them together, and then form a council to identify a systemic risk. And that ought to be people from the private sector, independent people, as well as regulators and even state regulators. Let them identify problems, and then let the agencies that are now charged with avoiding or remedying that take charge.
But the private sector, isn't the private sector the one? I mean, we were counting on them to identify risks at their own institutions in the past, which they fully failed to do. How can we rely on them now?
Well, Mark, in fact, several people warned about the inverse curve that the Fed allowed, which hurt the banks. They warned about the very low interest rate. There were several economists who did predict this with derivatives. There were even Warren Buffett back 5, 6 years ago called them weapons of mass destruction.
Unfortunately, none of them were running our nation's large banks. On the subject of the consumer protection,
and I'm not talking about CEOs of the banks. I'm talking about independent authorities like you know, a former SEC chairman, or things of that nature.
On consumer protection, if you're not in favor of that, you know, the $12 trillion mortgage market, lightly regulated, the largest direct-to-consumer market in this country that really had very little regulation, certainly planted the seeds for our financial crisis in many ways. What would you propose in terms of regulation on the mortgage market so that we don't have the same problems that we saw from 2002 to 2007?
Well, Mark, those problems were basically 3 things. There was gaps in the regulation. I think we've fixed a lot of those gaps. I know the Republican plan puts the responsibility within one agency. You also had forum shopping. You had institutions that went from one regulator to the other, and you had to dummy down. If you pull those all within one umbrella, you can't do that. And then we didn't have the subprime and credit cards. We now have regulations on the books, which we passed this year, which I think will remedy those problems. Now, the credit card legislation may create additional problems, but we've really had plenty of agencies, plenty of laws. We've not had enforcement, and in certain cases we didn't have the law.
Representative Bachus, real quick question. It's on health care, different than what we were talking about before, but Orrin Hatch says surcharge on the wealthy, dead on arrival. Do you agree?
Well, whether it's health care, whether it's energy, whether it's financial services, the consumer is going to pay because the government simply cannot do the job as well or as efficiently or as cost efficient as the private sector. So when you grow government, when you involve the government, when the government starts making the decision, they're going to ration care. Wherever you've had a health care program that was run by the government, there was rationing of care, there was diminished quality, and the costs went up. And that's not a recipe that I think the American people want. I don't think they want the government between them and their doctor.
Representative Bachus, thanks so much for joining us on all these key issues.
Thank you.
Investors really loving what